Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where it's another weekend reading report where Roger and I will talk to you about all of the stuff that I read this week and some of the stuff I'm going to read next week. And my progress in the 500 book challenge, the challenge where I'm reading 500 books I already own before I buy any new ones. And this is a great milestone in the 500 book challenge in that I've managed to read 10 books. Woohoo! In the 500 book challenge. Wow. Only 490 books to go. Yay! I'm rolling right along. Everybody else who's doing the 100 or 500 book challenge is way ahead of me, but oh well, what do you do? This week I managed to read 2 books, or I managed to finish 2 books, which seems to be right what I'm doing. I keep hoping that some week I'll read 3, but so far that has not happened. So let's talk about it. What did I read this week? Well, for Edgar Rice Burroughs, for my Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive, I'm still reading this wonderful biography. So this is the biography of Edgar Rice Burroughs, creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars and all those books I'm reading. And I've been reading this in the morning over coffee. However, due to circumstances, I only managed to spend 2 days over coffee reading this book, so didn't read as much of it as I'd like. I think last week, what was I at, page 80 or something? I don't remember. I'm at page 135 now. So not exactly rolling right along, but I got to some interesting things in Edgar Rice Burroughs' life in that we got to the beginning of his writing career. I've been reading all about how he's been failing at every job he's gotten. And even when he gets a good job, he'll quit it and try to go into business for himself or try out this get-rich-quick scheme, which always falls apart. So he's not a great success, Edgar Rice Burroughs, at this point in his life. 35 years old and has never really succeeded in business, which is what he's always wanted to succeed at. So he started writing, and he wrote A Princess of Mars, Under the Moons of Mars, and he sold it to All Story magazine. And so this talks about that, his first sale, and how he was very encouraged by that. And then he wrote his second book, The Outlaw of Torn, an historical book, and that one did not sell. But he was determined to get this thing to sell, so he rewrote it, and he was really stubborn, but he just couldn't sell this thing. Eventually he did. But in the beginning he couldn't. And then he moved on to Tarzan. And so at the point I'm at now, he's writing Tarzan. So it's interesting. It's interesting to finally get to his writing career, because of course that's the most interesting part if you're a reader of Edgar Rice Burroughs. But it is interesting to see kind of the trials and the tribulations of his life and how difficult it was to get to this point where he's writing these stories, and the difficulties he had at the beginning of his writing career. It's interesting stuff. So I'm enjoying it. I'm just not reading as much of it as I'd like. The first book I finished this week was for the Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive. That was this book. This is The Return of Tarzan. The Return of Tarzan. And this is a beautiful Joe Jusko cover with Law of Opar. And one of the greatest characters from Tarzan, and there's Tarzan there, and those are the kind of the beast men of Opar. This book, The Return of Tarzan, the much demanded sequel to Tarzan of the Apes, this is always entertaining, and it was entertaining this time. I've always kind of felt that this was my favorite Tarzan book. The first Tarzan novel is better. It's a better book. It's probably the best Tarzan. It is the best Tarzan book, is the first Tarzan novel. But this is almost as good, I think, in a lot of ways. And for me, it kind of is still my favorite, just because there's so many different Tarzan-y things in it. We get a lost city, we get Law of Opar, we get tons of adventure. And in the beginning of this book, Tarzan is in Paris. He's in civilization. And his civilization is only skin deep, as he would say. And so he's dealing with the fact that he's not with Jane. Jane is engaged to be married to his cousin, who is the Lord Greystoke, when actually Tarzan is really Lord Greystoke. But he couldn't make this known without taking away Clayton, his cousin's wealth and riches. And Jane would just stay with this guy, and so he'd be taking away all of this from Jane, too, if he claimed his title. It's all very dramatic. And so we've got Tarzan's adventures in civilization, which are a lot of fun. And then Tarzan becomes an agent for the French government. Now remember, Tarzan speaks French, because that's the language that he was taught first by his best friend D'Arnaud. And so when he does speak English, he speaks it with a French accent, as this book makes clear. And so he's an agent for the French government, and he goes to northern Africa, somewhere in northern Africa, and has some adventures there, and it's just a ton of fun. It's a ton of fun. And I had a great time reading The Return of Tarzan, an excellent sequel. The Tarzan series, from what I remember, kind of goes up and down in quality, but this one is dynamite. I really like this one an awful lot. So now, because nowadays I'm switching back from Edgar Rice Burroughs to another book, back to Edgar Rice Burroughs, until I finish my Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive. For my non-Burroughs book that I read this week, it was this one, Carl Edward Wagner's Why Not You and I, which is a short story collection which came out in 1987. Carl Edward Wagner was a fantasy writer best known for the Kane novels and stories, the Kane series of books. He's best known for that, although those stories and books are still not as well known as they should be for being such great works of fantasy fiction and being kind of the forerunners of grimdark fiction and fantasy. Just excellent stuff. But he was also a horror writer. He wrote horror stories, and a lot of those are really good. I've always kind of considered this one of my favorite books since I read it so many years ago. I actually read this probably in the early 90s because I got a used copy. I got this used copy of it. And I've always kind of considered it one of my favorite books. But I haven't read it like in decades. So I thought, you know what? Will I still feel the same about this book now? Will I love it just as much as I did when I first read it? Is it just as good as it was when I first read it? Yes and no. Kind of a mixed bag, actually. Which doesn't really surprise me because I was a much different person back in the 90s than I am now as a grumpy old man. I'm not as grumpy and old as Roger over here. You've been pretty grumpy lately. I mean, let's face it. But still kind of a grumpy old man. Especially if you consider how much older I am now than when I read this. But reading this now, it feels very different. However, this is very much a product of its time. These stories were written in the 70s and the 80s, the early 80s. And you can tell a lot of the concerns that people had back in the 80s, urban decay, crime, vice, all of that stuff is in here. All of those concerns are in here. And Carl Edward Wagner is one of those writers when he's writing horror fiction that, I mean, the darker the better, you know. I mean, to just make it more grimy and dark, just, you know, he ratchets that stuff up to 11 or 12. You know, he kind of reminds me of Andrew Vax the writer of the Burke novels of crime, those crime novels. Fax was another guy that was always like, you know what, this just isn't dark enough. I have to make it even more dark and gritty. I mean, it's that kind of thing, to the point where you're like, okay, I get it. It's dark. Okay. So there's a little bit of that in some of these stories. The opening story is a story called Into Whose Hands, which is a great opening. Excellent story. So it starts off really well. Then it goes to Old Loves, which is kind of a forgettable story. And then More Sinned Against, which is frankly terrible. It's a frankly terrible story about a young wannabe actress and her boyfriend who's terrible, who's a young wannabe actor, and all the sacrifices she makes so that he could become famous, and they're all drugged out because it's the 80s, so cocaine is everywhere in this book. And all of the horrible, she has to, like, of course, prostitute herself, and then she ends up in X-rated movies, and it's just like this slow slide into that kind of thing. And it's just, the lengths that he goes to in this story is just ridiculous. And it doesn't read like a story, really. It reads like a really bad outline for a terrible book, for like a terrible novel. The ending, though, it turns into a horror story at the very end, and I do appreciate the kind of EC Comics Tales from the Crypt type ending. So it ended well, but man, it was crap until you got there. To the point where I wondered if it was supposed to be a parody, because it reads like a parody of that kind of story. But since I couldn't tell, obviously it failed as a parody if it was intentionally supposed to be so. So that was a crap story. But then we had Shrapnel, which was okay. The Last Wolf, which was pretty good. Neither Brute Nor Human, which was good. That was a good story. And then we get to the stories that I think I remembered the most. And I think that's why I've always held this book in such high regard, is for the two long stories here. Sign of the Salamander and Blue Lady Come Back. Sign of the Salamander it's a pulp adventure story that was written as if it was a pulp adventure story from the pulps. When I originally read this, I didn't know who Manly Wade Wellman was, who was a pulp writer who wrote in Weird Tales in the 40s. He kind of followed up after Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard were all gone from the magazine. And he wrote a lot of kind of adventurous fantasy horror with these characters who were fighting against the powers of darkness. John Thunstone, the occult investigator, was one of Manly Wade Wellman's characters. And what Sign of the Salamander is, and I didn't realize it the first time I read it, is kind of a pastiche of Manly Wade Wellman's stories. It's written along those lines, with an occult investigator type who could have walked right out of a Manly Wade Wellman story. As it turns out, Carl Edward Wagner was very good friends with Manly Wade Wellman. He admired that writer an awful lot. And so it's no surprise that he wrote this story, just like a Manly Wade Wellman story. But although it has that kind of plot, it is a Carl Edward Wagner story. It's Carl Edward Wagner at his best. And he is at his best when he's a little bit fantastic or writing fantasy, as opposed to when he's doing stuff straight in the real world, usually. And so that is a dynamite story. It is great. And the next story after that was almost as good. And then it closes up with a decent story. So most of this book is just as good as I remembered it being. I'm certainly not impressed with the whole volume, but most of it holds up to my memories of how good these stories were. So all in all, it's excellent. So yeah, why not? And unfortunately, this is stupidly out of print. All of well, him too, but all of Carl Edward Wagner's books should be in print. He is that good of a writer. This is very hard to find. And the few times that his books and his stories have been reprinted, they've tended to be reprinted by small presses and stuff like that go out of print right away. And then they're tremendously expensive to try to get. So it is time to bring this guy's work back. So yeah, this was excellent. I enjoyed this for the most part, except for, the terrible stories. So there was that. Those are the two books I read. Books 9 and 10 of the 500 book challenge. The next Edgar Rice Burroughs book I've got to read, and I'll be starting on that tomorrow, is this one. I remember this being great. This is At the Earth's Core, one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' best stories. And we've got this great cover here by Frank Frazetta. I mean, just a dynamite cover for At the Earth's Core. This is a wee little book, so even with a busy week, I should be able to get through this no problem. And then I'll be reading something I'm a little frightened to read because it terrified the lady of the manor, and that would be this book, Poking Holes by Juan Valencia, of Plagued by Visions fame. So I hear that this is, well, not just from the lady of the manor, but from everybody else, that this is tremendously disturbing and really, really good, which doesn't surprise me. So Poking Holes, going to be reading that this week. I might need therapy at the end, but I'm pretty sure this is going to be great. So this is the other book I'm for sure going to read this week. After that, on the Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive, the next book that is coming up is this one, which is The Cave Girl. This is just like the worst cover imaginable, but from what I remember, this wasn't that great of a book. So The Crappy Cave Girl, from what I remember, maybe it's better than I remember it being, but I remember this being kind of a misfire from Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is still at the point of his career where he's at the beginning of his career, so he's trying different things. And The Cave Girl, going to be reading it real soon. But the last time I read it, I was probably, I don't even know, 17, 18 years old, or younger. So, I don't remember it all that well. After that is this book, which I remember fairly well because I remember liking this an awful lot. This is The Monster Men, originally titled Number 13, which is a weird cross between The Island of Dr. Moreau, Frankenstein, and Tarzan. I remember it being an odd book. It's probably the closest thing to a horror novel that Edgar Rice Burroughs ever wrote. Still ends up being more of an adventure story from what I remember. But yeah, I'll be reading this one after The Cave Girl. And what I'll have in between those two books, I don't know yet. We will see. I've yacked on long enough. Roger and I will see you next time.